It was a fact that would have made even the most ruthless Romans shudder. Even the infamous amphitheatres of Rome once banned a barbaric entertainment. Yet in Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, it was performed every night, with victims as young as 10 years old. It was called The Leader and the Swan, a sweet, innocent name. But on stage, the brutal truth emerged. A naked child lying motionless, while trained geese pecked at grains of rice scattered on her tender body. A crowd of 80,000 cheered, laughed, and threw coins at the girl's quivering body. This was not entertainment. This was a legalized human trafficking system, turning children into commodities for collective pleasure. Among those children was Theodora, who was only 10 years old. No one in the audience could have guessed that this little girl would become the most powerful woman in Byzantine history, the empress of the entire empire. But to transform into a political monster, she first had to go through hell. It all began with the death of her father, Acacius, the Greens' bearkeeper. In Constantinople in 504, the Blues and Greens were more than just horse racing teams. They were political parties that controlled the work, the entertainment, the lives of every citizen. Theodora's father, as the hippodrome's bear trainer, held a prominent position. By unwritten rule, his death would leave his family in the care of the family. But the greed of one official, Asterius, the Greens' entertainment boss, broke the rules. He took a bribe and gave the position to someone else, leaving his widow and 3 young children behind. From then on, Theodora's mother's only choice was to sacrifice her daughter to the system or let her family starve to death. She chose life, but in return was met with an unimaginable tragedy. To understand the horror, it is worth remembering that even Rome, where gladiatorial combats were once held to the death, considered Byzantine acts too cruel for civilized society, yet in Constantinople they were entertainment. In a humiliating display, Theodora's mother led her 3 daughters to the front of the hippodrome. They wore laurel wreaths, the symbol of supplicants, and marched to the cheers of 80,000 spectators. The sight was not a plea for mercy, but a public announcement. The 3 girls were now available for the city's entertainment industry. The Blues, who had put them in this situation, turned their backs on them. But the Blues, their political opponents, came to the rescue, offering Theodora's stepfather a small job. That moment was seared into her mind. Who had betrayed her? Who had helped her? And from there, Theodora nurtured a hatred that would define her entire life. At the age of 10, she was thrown into the most humiliating performances, becoming the star of Leader and the Swan. But unlike many other children who collapsed in despair, Theodora observed and learned. She realized, when desire took over, the most powerful men revealed their fatal weaknesses. The hippodrome, the colossal arena of Constantinople, became Theodora's diabolical university. There she learned not to read, but to read men. Not in books, but in the lustful glances, in the fits of incontinence, in the humiliation they showed themselves when they believed they possessed a child. Those harsh lessons would become her weapons in the future. But at that time, no one expected that the death of a bear tamer would be the beginning of the birth of the most dangerous woman in Byzantine history, and that's just the beginning. At age 10, Theodora entered a world that even adults would have difficulty enduring. Backstage at the hippodrome, where the smell of alcohol, sweat, and the roar of the crowd mingled, children like her were treated as commodities. Byzantine law at the time stated that actors and stage performers were to be classified in the same class as prostitutes. In other words, as soon as a child donned a costume, her body became public property. During the Leader and the Swan act, Theodora lay motionless, scattering barley grains for the geese to peck at. Cheers echoed throughout the arena, and coins flew down, clattering on her trembling flesh. But that was only the prelude to the nightmare. Once the audience had left, the real game began in the cramped back rooms, where senators, merchants, and nobles entertained themselves by exploiting the young performers. Instead of learning to read or play childish games, Theodora was forced to learn another language, the language of male desire. A look, a gasp, a hesitant touch, all were vital signals for her to guess what they wanted and how to survive. The frightening thing was that Theodora did not simply submit, she observed. She began to analyze the details. The majestic senator outside, alone, trembling and humiliated. The rich merchant willing to pay a high price just to hear a few words of wisdom from her. Theodora understood a dark secret. The most powerful people are the most vulnerable to hunger. While many other children were shattered, Theodora turned the arena into her own secret school. Every performance was a lesson, every client was a test, and every humiliation, instead of breaking her, became data for her to remember. Gradually, the Hippodrome became more than just a hellhole. It was a university of manipulation. Theodora learned to listen, to observe, and most importantly, to make the powerful reveal their weaknesses. It was these years that transformed her from victim to apprentice in the art of power. The polarization was also deeply ingrained in her mind. The Greens, who had abandoned her family, were her sworn enemies. The Blues, who had come to her stepfather's aid, became symbols of loyalty. Theodora's world was reduced to two opposing colors, and she never forgot who had betrayed her and who had helped her. By the age of 16, Theodora was no longer the frightened little girl she once was. She had become the highly sought-after star of the Hippodrome, famous not only for her looks, but also for her wit and sharpness. Customers paid not just for physical pleasure, but for conversation, to hear the subtleties they could not find in anyone else. People thought they owned Theodora, but the truth was the opposite. Theodora was testing her control over them. Each meeting she tested a new hypothesis, how to turn desire into weakness, how to shake power, and each time she remembered the results. Then opportunity presented itself. A Syrian governor named Hesebelus came to Constantinople and saw Theodora perform. He didn't want her for one night. He wanted her forever. The offer sounded like an extraordinary sentence. Follow me to Libya. You will never return to the Hippodrome. For a young woman who had endured 6 years of hell, it seemed like a way out. Theodora nodded. She left Constantinople, taking with her all the hard-won lessons from the Hippodrome, and entered a new phase of her life. But Libya is not a release. It is the next chapter of a terrible training course, where Theodora will learn to turn desire into a political weapon, and where she will discover that even those who seem to be her benefactors can become the most ruthless traitors. Libya, 516. After 6 years of being made a show of at the Hippodrome, Theodora thought she had escaped hell. Governor Hesebelus, one of the most powerful officials in the empire, brought her back to his lavish palace. For the first time, Theodora had a soft bed, plenty of food, and silk clothes. For a 16-year-old girl, it seemed like a reward after hell. But the truth was different. Over the next 4 years, Theodora discovered that the palace was just another kind of arena. At the Hippodrome, she learned how to read crowds and customers. In Libya, she learned a lesson of a higher order, how a powerful man manages, rules, and succumbs to lust. Hesebelus thought he possessed Theodora as an ornament. But Theodora, instead of being infatuated with luxury, began to observe. Every time he removed his official robes, she realized a familiar truth. The man who could control armies and treasury was completely powerless before the body of a girl. She experimented subtly, a touch withdrawn at the right moment, an ambiguous word of affection, a look that was half rejecting, half accepting. All of it made Hesebelus lose control. Gradually, Theodora recognized a new tool: dependence. When men depend on pleasure, they lose the ability to make wise decisions. From victim, Theodora transformed herself into an observer of power. She saw how Hexabolus would change policies, make concessions to officials, or delay government affairs for the sake of a promise or a cold shoulder from her. If at the Hippodrome she had learned that desire reveals weakness, in Libya she had learned a new layer. Desire can be a rein for power. But this game could not last. When Theodora began to use her charms to influence political decisions, Hexabolus realized. And the reaction of a powerful person whose power was challenged was always the same. Anger, then revenge. In a fit of rage, he drove her away. No more silks, no more palaces, no more leftovers. Just a scorching desert, the few possessions thrown out like trash. Theodora, barely 20, was left penniless. But this time, she was no longer an innocent child. She had the most dangerous asset of all. Knowledge. Knowledge of the psychology of powerful men, of how lust could bend politics. It was from this betrayal that Theodora learned. She was not just a victim, but a potential predator. Back in the stormy world, Theodora began her journey of wandering across the Mediterranean. On each cramped ship, in each stinking cabin, she continued to sell herself to survive. But now, each customer was not just a buyer, but a living experiment. A Roman merchant revealed his business secrets after a few sweet compliments. A captain revealed his smuggling ring because he thought she was genuinely interested. All became material in the library of power that Theodora was secretly building. The trip also brought another turning point. In Alexandria, she met the Monophysite monks, a branch of Christianity considered heretical by the imperial court. Theodora converted, not just out of faith, but out of strategy. By connecting with a persecuted community, she found a network of political patronage independent of those who had commodified her. But most importantly, on a trip to Antioch, Theodora heard a strange rumor. In Constantinople, a 40-year-old prince named Justinian was asking about her, about the girl who had survived Libya, who had the ability to make powerful men lose their minds. As the ship bore Theodora back to the city where her childhood had been shattered, the golden dome of Constantinople reflected in the water. But this time, she was no longer a child shivering on the sands of the Hippodrome. She had returned as a predator, armed with a lifetime of exploitation, ready to exploit an empire in return. Constantinople, 522. After years of wandering, Theodora returns to the city that swallowed her childhood. But she is no longer the little girl shivering on the sands of the Hippodrome. She has transformed herself into a weapon, a woman who understands the deepest weaknesses of men, and the city is about to pay the price. At a royal banquet, amid purple robes and sparkling jewels, Theodora appeared as if the whole room had lost its light just to honor her. People whispered, "Isn't that the girl who performed at the Hippodrome?" The whisper was full of contempt. But there was one look that was not contemptuous. That look belonged to Justinian, the grandson of Emperor Justin, who was then over 40 years old, but still unmarried. For Justinian, it was love at first sight. But for Theodora, it was the greatest battle of her life. For 16 years, she had learned to hold the reins of male desire. Now, her opponent was not a merchant or a provincial governor. It was the heir to the throne. Theodora began with her usual weapon, intellect. Unlike other beauties who only knew how to flatter, she talked about law, religion, and strategy. Justinian, an intellectual passionate about reform, was immediately captivated. As they talked each night, he realized that he could not live without this woman. Theodora had found the right weak spot. He needed someone who would be both a lover and an intellectual ally. The infatuation quickly turned into a political scandal. The nobility cried out, "An actress? A prostitute? Can't enter the royal family." Roman law also strictly forbade, "Once an actress, she can never become the wife of an official." The sole purpose of that law was to prevent women like Theodora from rising to power. But this very opposition inadvertently empowered her. By forcing Justinian to choose between political honor and love with her, Theodora pushed him into a situation where she knew the outcome for sure. Desire always won. But there was one final obstacle. Empress Euphemia, the wife of Emperor Justin, a former slave who had risen to the throne. Euphemia saw something in Theodora that no one else dared to say. This is not just a marriage, it is a conquest. She fiercely opposed it, blocking every legal path for Justinian to marry Theodora. Then, suddenly, in 523, Euphemia died in her sleep. No illness, no signs, no explanation. People whispered about Theodora's invisible hand. For in the world she lived in, experienced women knew of herbs that could kill without leaving a trace. No one dared to say for sure, but everyone knew. A few months later, the ban on nobles marrying actresses was lifted, and in 525, Theodora entered the Hagia Sophia in royal purple. The girl who had once had coins thrown at her was now dressed in imperial purple. The crowd was astonished, some were outraged, but everyone knew, from now on, Theodora was no longer a victim. She was the Empress of Byzantium. At that wedding, each step she took was like a knife carving into history, from sex slave to the most powerful woman in the empire. But this was only the beginning. For Justinian's love for her would soon be tested in the fiery Nika rebellion, where Theodora would prove that a once-trodden child could be more cruel than any tyrant. January 532. Constantinople seethes like a pot of boiling water. The Byzantine Empire is in turmoil. Taxes, corruption, and pent-up political discontent have turned the hippodrome into a fiery explosion of anger. The blues and the greens, generational foes, unite for the first time in a single cry. Nika, Nika, victory. But the crowd wanted more than just the overthrow of the government. They wanted to humiliate a person, Theodora. For tens of thousands of citizens, the former hippodrome queen was a symbol of disgrace. They could not accept that a woman who had had money thrown at her was now wearing a purple robe, on par with the emperor. The Nika chant also had an implicit meaning. The bitch must die. The fire burned for 4 days. The ancient Hagia Sophia burned. The Senate was reduced to ashes. Soldiers deserted, and the imperial family moved to install a replacement, Hypatius, the grandson of a former emperor. The crowds cheered, believing that Justinian's reign, and with it, the filthy woman Theodora, was over. Fear gripped the palace. Justinian, the all-powerful emperor, listened to his advisors trembling. All pleaded, "Run, take your gold and silver to the port, board the ships, and escape before it is too late." They believed that escape was the only way out. But then Theodora stood up. The room was dead silent, save for the distant sound of the fire. Her purple silk gown fluttered, and her eyes swept over each pale face. Then, in a deep, firm voice, she said the words that would go down in history. "The throne is the most beautiful shroud. It is better to die in a purple robe than to live in shame." It was more than a challenge. It was a flood of childhood memories, nights of mob abuse, coins dropped on her, scornful stares. The mob was now calling for her life, but she had learned from a young age that crowds could be manipulated, turned into spectators for any show. And today, she would turn the entire city into a stage for the greatest revenge in history. Justinian, bound by his obsession with his wife, complied. His loyal generals Belisarius and Mundus took command. The plan was simple but brutal. Lure the entire rebel army into the hippodrome, the very place where Theodora had been humiliated, then lock the gates and massacre them. That day, more than 100,000 people crowded into the arena, thinking they were witnessing the coronation of the new emperor Hypatius. They cheered and sang, just like the days of the leader and the swan. But when the iron gates slammed shut, the cheers turned to screams. The imperial army poured in from all directions. Swords flashed, Spears stabbed relentlessly. Blood sprayed the stone walls. Screams of anguish resounded, and people were trampled. There was no escape. Within hours, the hippodrome had become a living cemetery. More than 30,000 corpses lay piled on the sand, the same sand that had soaked Theodora's childhood tears. The coincidence was cruel and horrifying. The place where she was once turned into entertainment was now the place where she killed thousands of challengers. It was her final performance, and she was the director. After the massacre, Justinian held on to his throne. But make no mistake, the one who truly saved the throne was Theodora. With a single speech and a cold-blooded decision, she transformed herself from victim to terrorizer of an entire empire. From that day on, no official dared to look down on her as a performer. What did they see? They saw 30,000 corpses, proving that behind the purple silk dress was a soul forged in hell, ready to dip its hands in blood so as not to be humiliated again. And that was just the beginning of the bloody reign that Theodora would rule alongside Justinian. After the Nika massacre, Constantinople was as silent as a cemetery. 30,000 bodies had just been buried in the sands of the hippodrome, and fear was spreading through the streets. No one dared to question the power of the Empress any longer. From then on, people began to understand. Byzantine power had two levels: the throne of Justinian and the shadow of Theodora. While the emperor sat in his grand hall receiving envoys and settling disputes, Theodora ruled from the back rooms. These were not bedrooms, but the secret intelligence centers of the empire. She understood that the most dangerous enemy was not an invading army, but the intimate secrets of those who sat next to the throne. Theodora organized a network of spies, including eunuchs, maids, and even courtesans, who could gain access to places where power never thought possible. They listened to pillow whispers, gathered banquet secrets, and memorized the sexual preferences of senators. Every little tidbit, every shameful habit, every forbidden passion, all became weapons in the hands of the Empress. To assert her position, Theodora also instituted a shocking ritual for the court. Anyone who came to see the Emperor and Empress had to kneel and kiss both their feet. It was more than a formality, it was a humiliating reversal. Once she had been forced to perform a lowly act in front of the crowd, now she forced the entire nobility to experience the same thing, bowing before a woman who had been a lowly actress. But control by fear alone was not enough. Theodora understood that some enemies needed to be eliminated at the source, and so began a series of cleverly disguised political assassinations. In 537, the first target, Pope Silverius. When the Pope refused to support her religious faction, Monophysite, Theodora took immediate action. She did not argue theology, but played on the fear of powerful men, being considered a traitor. With just a few words of instigation through, Belisarius and his wife, Silverius, was accused of conspiring with the Goths. The result? Dethroned, exiled, and died alone. No knife, no poison, just inciting fear in others. Next came a more dangerous target, the Ostrogoth queen Amalasuntha, a powerful, beautiful woman who had dared to correspond intimately with Justinian. Theodora saw the signs immediately. Amalasuntha was using the same art of intellectual seduction she had used to bind Justinian. History could not be allowed to repeat itself, Theodora ordered. The result? Amalasuntha was brutally murdered in her bath. A woman's most vulnerable moment. The message was, "Whoever touches my husband, I will destroy." The climax of the assassination network came with the case of John the Cappadocian, the powerful financial official, the only one who did not succumb to the Queen's threats. John was intelligent, knew the tricks of manipulation, and was almost immune to her familiar weapon. But Theodora knew anyone can be broken with the right method. For 6 months, she reenacted the mental torture she had endured as a child. This time on John. He was constantly given haunting gifts, daggers, funeral wreaths, execution drawings. Gradually, John became sleepless, deranged, and jumped at the slightest noise. As his mind broke, Theodora struck the final blow. A political trap with the help of Antonina, Belisarius's wife. John was recorded as rebellious, and his fortunes were instantly ruined, from infamous minister to disgraced vagabond. Each enemy fallen is not only a political victory, but also a piece of revenge for a humiliated childhood. Theodora is doing to herself what the world did to her, breaking her spirit, crushing her dignity, forcing others to their knees. From the palace, she was more than just a queen. She was the architect of a shadow government where power came not from the army or the law, but from the control of fear and desire. But those who live in the shadows always pay a price. And Theodora is about to enter a new phase, one in which she will decide not only the fate of her enemies, but the fate of women across the empire. In the years following the Nika rebellion, Constantinople no longer dared to ignore Theodora, not only because of the 30,000 bodies in the hippodrome, but because everyone knew that behind every decision Justinian made, she was looming. But unlike many dictators who lived by fear, Theodora wanted to leave her mark deeper, in the law. From the secret chambers where she ran her intelligence network, Theodora began to plot a revolution. Her goal was not just immediate power, but to carve her name into the legal structure of the empire, for she knew better than anyone. If the laws had been written to enslave her, they could be rewritten to serve revenge. In the Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundational code of Western law that would later become the basis for the modern legal system, Theodora's legacy is still evident. She focused first on the thing that had ruined her childhood: forced prostitution. The new law prohibited pimps from preventing women from leaving the trade, closed down brothels that violated the law, and severely punished those who forced women into prostitution. To the world, this was a humanitarian reform. But to Theodora, it was a verdict on the system that had crushed her. No child should ever have to go through what I went through. But revenge was never simple. She founded the Metanoia monasteries, where reformed prostitutes gathered. But beneath the religious facade, it was also Theodora's way of controlling other women's bodies, just as her own had been controlled. It was both protective and possessive. She didn't just end a system, she replaced it with her own. In marriage, Theodora pounced on the injustices women had suffered. She granted wives broader rights to divorce, made rape a death sentence, regardless of whether the victim was slave or free. The rapist's property was confiscated and given directly to the victim. This was not just justice. It was legalized revenge, written in the language of the law itself. Theodora also interfered in court marriages. She arranged and forced officials to marry according to her political strategy. Anyone who opposed her, she did not hesitate to eliminate. These marriages were not simply family alliances, but chains that ensured that her power would flow through the generations. And when we look at the nature of those laws, we see a cold paradox. Women who were once turned into property of the crowd now turn political power into a tool to own the fate of others. Yet, Theodora's legacy is undeniable. Many of the things she imposed in revenge became progressive principles in European law hundreds of years later. Laws protecting women, punishing rapists, expanding the right to divorce. All stemmed from the memory of a child who had been abused on the sands of the hippodrome. But the law was no shield against fate. As her power grew, her body began to betray her. Illness, perhaps cancer, gnawed at her from within. And for someone who had once turned humiliation into a weapon, death would be the final act, one she could not control. Theodora, Empress of Byzantium, was only 48 years old, but her body was already exhausted. Later, historians speculated that she died of breast cancer, a disease that medicine at the time had no power over. The woman who had walked through blood and humiliation had finally succumbed to a silent enemy within her body. Her death was more than a personal loss. It exposed the stark truth: Justinian could not have survived without Theodora. After the Empress's death, the Emperor sank into despair. He never remarried, losing his ability to rule effectively. For the remaining 17 years, the empire produced no major reforms, a testament to the fact that Theodora, not Justinian, was the soul of the dynasty. In the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, a surviving mosaic depicts Theodora towering over all, those around her wearing a purple robe embroidered with the Magi offering sacrifices. It is more than a tribute. It is a declaration. The woman whose naked body had once been pelted with coins is now the equal of a holy king. But Theodora's legacy is not just in paintings, but also in law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation of later Western law, bears her mark. Women's rights were expanded, rape was severely punished, forced prostitution was outlawed. What began as a personal vendetta became a legal landmark for centuries. Yet at the same time, history reveals a bitter paradox. Theodora was both victim and predator. She saved many women from a tragic fate, but also built a new system of control. She avenged her childhood, but at the same time caused the deaths of tens of thousands of people during the Nika revolt. She is a symbol of liberation, but also a testament to the devastation that trauma can leave behind. Today, tourists walk along the grounds of the old hippodrome, where only columns and ruins remain. Few would imagine that this was the place where a child was humiliated by a mob, and that years later, it was also the place where she ordered the killing of 30,000 people. A circle is complete, from victim to destroyer. The final question lingers. Has Theodora truly escaped her past? Or has she merely turned her pain into a weapon to unleash upon the world? Whatever the answer, no one can deny. From the dust of the hippodrome, Theodora rose to become one of the most powerful and dangerous women in human history. And her name, that once despised child, is now engraved alongside those of emperors, immortalized in time.